Innovative Virtual Engagement Programs of 2021, presented by Within3. I'm Julia Douther with Fierce Pharma. Our speakers today are Lance Hill, Chief Executive Officer at Within3, and Natalie DeMombro, Vice President, Learning and Development at Within3. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. And for best quality, make sure that your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on demand within 24 hours of the event. And time permitting, and we will have time today, we'll follow the presentation with the Q&A session. So please submit your questions using the Q&A tab, the questions and answers tab on the left side of your screen, and you can do that at any time during the presentation. Okay, now let's begin. Lance, Natalie, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Hello, everyone. So I'm Lance Hill, as Julie mentioned. Thrilled to see you all. Bios are available. Just very, very quickly about me. I'm a technologist by background, and my passion is determining ways that technology can help health generally and life science organizations specifically be much more effective. And so I've dedicated the last 20 years of my life to that, and thrilled to talk about that today. And Natalie, maybe just give you a little bit of color, and we'll dive in on yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Natalie DeMombro here, VP of Learning and Development. My background is I help clients and our colleagues work with the platform and optimize the use of the software. So I'm going to really cover the case studies today, and I'm excited to tell you how they are optimizing virtual engagement to meet their goals. So I'm glad to have you here.
All right, great. So let's talk about what we're going to try to cover today. So there are a lot of different engagement technologies. So by engagement, what we mean is two-way dialogue. So what we're not covering today is ways you can push messages out virtually to a broad audience that sort of disseminate data or evidence kind of one to many. We're going to really be talking about the two-way dialogue that you have with customers, stakeholders, patients, payers, physicians, NGOs, scientists, researchers, economists, etc. And the audience today is medical affairs, is really where we're centered in all the ways that medical affairs, from trying to understand the very broad set of disease communities, all the way down to one-on-one interactions. There's so much communication that happens. And so 2021 obviously was a really unusual year. Depending on where you are in the world, you experience sets of travel restrictions that were either coming or going. And that affected us as an industry, both internally, how are we communicating within our companies? And one of the examples today, we'll talk about that. A company is something really interesting there. And then how are we talking externally in this world as well? So we're going to talk through the overview of some of the hybrid tools. We're going to talk through some of the ways that innovation kind of entered the area. And then we're going to go through, and we selected, of the thousands of programs that Within3 clients run every year, we selected 3 that we thought were really, really interesting and innovative ways to accomplish pretty critical functions within medical affairs that Natalie will take the lead on.
All right. Let's get to the next one here. So I thought it would be a good idea to just level set and give you guys an example of the types of tools that clients are now using within their overall strategy for the year and how they're most effective. So we're calling it an engagement toolkit because each one of these tools has a specific use, and we'll just go through them and I'll give you some examples. So the first is on-demand anytime video. So this is, we're a binge watching culture. We should all know what this is. We like to watch videos on our own time. Well, we found that our, HCPs and clients alike like to be able to log in, and if there's video content, perhaps a didactic presentation or a training, something that doesn't really involve two-way discussion, that's really best served as an on-demand anytime video. And we'll talk about a couple examples of how that was used well later in the program. Live webcasts, webinars as well. We're on that right now. It requires everyone to be in the same place at the same time, even if it's at their home office or desk. But importantly, these should be used, and when they are used well, they're used for dialogue and interactivity. So we wouldn't typically put a didactic presentation on a webcast because that doesn't involve, people talking back and forth. So, when clients are using webcasts, they're really thinking about how to maximize that time that people have scheduled and moved, things around to be together. Let's get everybody talking and think about the time spent around the table. Asynchronous overtime meetings. So for those of you who've ever been in an online university course, you may already know what this is, but essentially it's overtime. So we're talking maybe a few weeks. There are milestones along the way and different reminders to keep the group engaging on the same path, but on their own time. So, I can log in at night and I can put in my answers and see what the other group has talked about. And then I can respond. And it is a dialogue. So it's not a survey. It's not a one-way. It's truly a two-way engagement, but it's done over a few weeks. And there's a moderator making sure that the participation is maximized. So that's a very good venue to use for deep discussion. If you're looking for, we have a lot of clinical teams that will use it to get analysis on protocols prior to the live meeting. And we'll talk about a couple good examples of that as well. Digital document collaboration. So if you've all used something like Google Docs or some sort of shareware, it's just collaborating on a document over time, perhaps editing it together as a group. And this can be done in the context of an asynchronous session or even a live session, but typically it's done over time, and whoever is moderating it would have to have some deadlines built in. And then again, 24/7 virtual community discussion boards. This is almost like if you've ever been in an intranet in your company, this could be that. We have customers and clients who use this to, like speaker bureaus, for instance. They can have a group of people in a private community who are all accessing the same assets or versions of documents and then talking about them. And that's truly a 24/7 ongoing conversation. So less about the deadlines and milestones, but more about just communicating and sharing, over time. And then finally, the tried and true email and phone interviews. These are actual virtual engagement tools. Sometimes we don't think of it that way, but it is something that is happening and on your own time. You're emailing and going into your email, and you can be on the phone. Again, engaging with others in those old formats that we all know and love, but sometimes they can be a little bit excessive and take a lot of extra time. So we want to really think about when we're going to use those, and it's really just a one-on-one. And then finally, in-person meetings. They are still part of the toolkit. What we do when we work with clients is talk about, it is hard to get scheduling and get everybody together and flying into the same place. We want to make sure that those in-person meetings are maximized engagement. So do we have time for everybody to talk? Is everybody doing something that's constructive? Again, we wouldn't always ask for a didactic presentation in these types of meetings, but rather possibility to engage and relate to each other and have discussion that's really, really productive. So the idea, and you'll see this as we go into the innovation side of things, is to pick and choose thoughtfully when you're making a hybrid engagement. And so we can go to the next
just a couple of comments there too. So this isn't exhaustive. There's some other technologies, virtual reality technology as an example. Companies are experimenting with that and trying to see where that can fit in. I think the main theme here is that 5 or 6 years ago, if you were going to plan any sort of two-way dialogue, two-way engagement, you'd pick one, maybe two of the things on this list, and that would be your kind of plan for that meeting or that engagement. Fast forward to where we are now, and the most effective ways to engage folks is to combine one or more of the things on this list into an effective engagement that maybe isn't even just a point in time, it's a one and done, but allows you to engage a bit more continuously over time. And so some organizations have some of these sets of technologies standardized by their IT environment, and that's great. And you kind of have a set of tools. Others at a team level may have access to some of these sets of capabilities, maybe through agencies that you work with may have access to some of these capabilities. But from an industry point of view, being familiar with the array of what's possible, and so that as you're thinking about what you're trying to accomplish from a business point of view, utilizing the absolute best combination of technologies. The other thing I'll just mention before we move on is as travel restrictions lift with the pandemic, depending on where you are in the world, there's obviously live meetings coming into prominence. But if you look at live meetings, those meetings are hybrid now, meaning that they're live, but there is always a digital online component to them. And that is really what the world expects. That's what our customers expect. That's what we expect when we're involved in any type of live meeting. And so being proficient at building an experience that covers both live and digital simultaneously can be very powerful and as well. So go ahead now. Sorry.
I was saying, I really like that point that it's not just a one and done, where it used to really be that you're choosing this or that. It's just an ongoing conversation that's happening with all of these different tools kind of in the mix. To the next one here. So I think too, and Lance was alluding to, is that we're all starting to think a little bit differently, but not only are we thinking differently about the tools that are being used, but we're thinking differently about what are our goals and what type of impact are we looking to get from using these tools. And these are just some of the examples. I've put these up on the screen because we're going to revisit these as we go through the case studies today. A lot of times when we work with clients, these are the surprise moments that, when we debrief about one of the programs they've done, they're surprised and thrilled really at some of the outcomes beyond just, saving on travel, which is already expected. So a few of them just to note, and I'll point out diversity and inclusivity, because this one to me is one of the most valuable. What we're seeing is that there are just more people around the table. When you move it to a virtual engagement, whether it be a webcast or whether it be asynchronous or one of those 24/7 communities, you're just able to reach more people, whether it be regions speaking different languages, underserved populations. So you're able to start thinking about, if I could, have anybody meet, who would it be? Versus how we used to think, which was, I have 12 seats around a table at an airport hotel. Who can I afford to bring in there? And who are those voices that I have to hear from because I can't afford anybody else? So it's a really different way of looking at it. I know I used to do planned meetings, and it feels very freeing to be able to think about, who could I, if I could, hear from anybody, who would I choose? So that's that diversity and inclusivity. And then patient centricity as well. It's around the same thing. It's not just talking the talk, us in a room talking about patient centricity. It's actually bringing in patients in a thoughtful, considerate, and private way to let them tell you about their experience and their challenges with, whatever they are going through within the disease state. I don't know if, Lance, you want to highlight a couple of these as well.
Yeah, I think of all of these, again, just to kind of build on what Natalie's saying, there's side effects that you don't necessarily expect when you build a strong program, and you can really change the trajectory of what you're doing as a company by thinking about how some of these other benefits are happening along the way, in addition to achieving whatever the primary goal is. And I think as we dive into the case studies, you'll see some of these programs and some of these ancillary benefits that these companies achieved by combining these different types of engagement technologies together. So I do see there are a couple of questions coming in. Just want to make sure there is a Q&A function. And so if you have questions along the way, please feel free to answer them. We'll be hitting them towards the end of the presentation as well. I want to remind everyone of that.
Perfect.
So just to level set to across, again, we're Meta specific today with this call and this audience. And when you look at two-way dialogue, it really happens across both the life cycle of a drug and medical affairs' involvement and all the different things that are listed here and more. And when you look at some of those different things, they're very, very important. And so, for example, looking at what you might be doing, advisory panels to understand clinical practices, looking at economics and working with those sorts of audiences and HEOR and so forth, looking at finding unmet needs, trying to understand MSL and engagement and MSL training and MSL interaction. All of these things are places where you can make an impact, and they all require that two-way dialogue back and forth versus kind of a one-way push. And similarly, if you think about a year that you might have, there is no shortage of opportunity from medical congresses and interactions, again, advisory boards, training, really all across the year, you end up engaging so many different ways and so many different times. And you can gain a lot of value in looking at your year as a whole and understanding how to apply or what's the right combination of capabilities that you want to drive across that year. And so when you look at it, an engagement plan as a year versus next meeting, then the next meeting, then the next meeting, you can also begin to be very innovative. One of the advantages that digital tools do, whichever kind you're looking at, is they drastically lower the cost to engage, which Natalie has talked about. But a side effect of that means, because the cost is lower, you can engage more people more frequently, and you can rethink your engagement strategy from I'm going to execute 3 or 4 meetings this year to I'm going to be engaging these people across the year in ways that make sense and even in bite-sized ways as well. And so these tools really drastically improve the flexibility. And that's great for industry. It's great for us, but it's also great for physicians and those we're interacting with, because we can meet them where they are versus meet them where we need them to be. And we can bring content to them in more bite-sized chunks, bite-sized interaction, more convenient for them. And that's going to create better engagement, better retention of information that we're sharing, and so forth. So thinking about it broad screen is always helpful. And companies that do that, we see really do come up with ways that stand out from the pack in terms of how they're talking to their clients.
And I think too, just to hit on this slide for a moment, looking at your year from an operational perspective, one of the things you can do is see where those milestones are that aren't moving. So we always typically will start with maybe congresses or a PDUFA date or something that we know is happening, and then you start to build around it. So just a note, if you're starting to get the wheels turning and thinking about how this can apply to you, think about the non-moving targets first, and then some of those moving targets where virtual may be the best option, so that that's prepared and you have contingency plans and you have things in place, not only to reach the most people, but to be able to be as flexible as possible with things you don't know are going to happen yet. So I think just it's a nice starting place, and it's often where we start with clients when we're talking about the year as a whole. And that brings us to
the fun part. Let's get into it.
Fun part. So yeah, so speaking of operationalizing it, we thought the best way to really show this, sometimes it just feels so conceptual when we're just talking high level. So let's show you how clients have done this and done this well. These were some recent programs that we thought we'd highlight, something a little bit different than the typical case studies of hybrid. So we're just going to show you 3 that we thought were really effective today. And we're going to also show you the tools and the impact that they had for each of them. So we thought that would be a good way to set it up. And I'm going to click to the next one, Lance, and you can maybe get us started with big picture for each, and then I'll tell everybody how they accomplished what they did.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So one of the most important functions within medical affairs is consistent skills growth of teams. Training, there's always new science, new information coming out. There's new information coming out from your company. There's information coming out from everything else that's happening within the disease community. And MSLs in the field and those involved need to constantly stay on top of that information. And so companies typically have very formalized top-down sorts of training programs. And then there's a lot of bottoms-up activity that happens as well, where different teams in different therapeutic areas or different regions try to figure out ways to do that. And a very common ways is a journal club. And so, journal clubs are things that if you're an MD, you're probably familiar with from medical school, where you're kind of following journals and having discussions in groups. That's something that's very commonly repeated with MSLs teams, as an example, in industry. And so this was an example of, during 21, the other issue with this too is field teams are typically geographically spread out on purpose so that they can be near where their customers are. And so you have a double whammy, if you will, that you have all this new information, new science come in, and you're also just kind of physically isolated. Whether there's a pandemic or not, that tends to be the case. So this was a company and a therapeutic team that was looking at how can we really jazz up our journal clubs? How can we make it so it's not just the journal gets sent out, everyone says, thank you, got it, there's a comment or two, and then nothing else happens? How can we actually make it fun, exciting, have people engage, have people feel a sense of community around this periodic delivery of content. And so that's what this example is. And I'll turn to Nally to show what they did and how they did it.
Sure. So let me click here. So here was the idea. Now, I really like this one. I'm a podcast person. I'm on the computer all day, so my eyes are always tired. I like to take my walks and listen. I guess this moderator had the same idea. Maybe we all need a little break from looking at things and we need to listen a little bit. So he recorded a podcast, which was really based on the article at hand. So these were going to be monthly podcasts. The article would be posted. This is an asynchronous session. So you would have the recording, in this case, an MP3. You would have the article at hand, and then you'd have some questions that were posted so that there could be that two-way discussion. And I was thinking too, just, as a podcast host, I would imagine being able to engage with your listeners that quickly could be really, really cool. So they did that. And this was an internal session. So it was MSLs with a medical leader within the organization who was an expert in this area. And the questions really brought out some two-way dialogue, some new insights that they didn't really even know about, and became a new way of operating for this group. So they didn't have to meet in person. They didn't have to have timely time out of their day together and schedule that. They were really able to do this over time. And the outputs were transcripts that were organized by the article. So these could then become enduring materials that were housed within a 24/7 community. So, I love the podcast idea. I think it's a nice break, but I also think being able to track who listened to a podcast would be a really cool way to understand who's learning and absorbing the material that's being disseminated. So I'm going to get into kind of how we're measuring these as innovative. Let's go here. So the tools used, you might have heard on-demand anytime video, in this case, audio. They actually used two. So the video was for the training. Instead of having the group meet on a webcast, again, these are MSLs, they're busy in the field. They had them watch a very quick video so they knew what was expected. It was the moderator up front giving a few points of, here are the goals for this interaction. And then our team went ahead and did the training, about 10 minutes of video that they watch before they get started. Anytime audio was the podcast. So that was there, and it was required as they came in. So they had to listen to it before they could engage within the questions. So a thoughtful way to make sure that, internal teams are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Asynchronous over time. So the whole thing was housed within an asynchronous session. As we talked about, this was a few weeks. They were going to be run every month. So we're getting on a cadence. This is a new way of thinking and operating for a team. Always a best practice, whether it's a steering committee, something like this, where it's a monthly team meetup. But the idea is to do things repetitively so people can get used to it. And you typically see an increase in participation as the months go on, because it's just how they connect now. And finally, the 24/7 virtual community discussion board. That was just the enduring materials that are going to be housed going forward in one place, so that they can access not only the podcast episodes, but also the articles. And then as new people join the MSL teams, you can direct them to that 24/7 discussion board community and let them see what they have missed. So it kind of catches up those who are joining the team. I'm going to give this one 3 badges. So they get operational excellence, just a really good way of training a group that's situated all over the US. Sustainability, cutting down on the need to meet in person, just extra printing and materials that are required for bringing groups together and the logistics of that. And then finally, building relationships. It is hard to build relationships internally when you're situated all over the globe, but having even just first hearing the voice, seeing the video, getting to know the person, the host, and then having the two-way dialogue, it can continue. It's how the questions are posed and the intention of the session that allows for that building relationship. So again, it's not a survey, it's not a one-way dialogue. They're dialoguing over time, and that's more time spent together, even if it is asynchronous in this type of venue.
So we had a couple. I'm going to jump in. I'll take a couple of questions early, actually. So there are a couple of questions that came in while Nally was talking around the technology here with the asynchronous technology. One was kind of, we have Slack, we have email. Do we need yet another technology? What's the difference? And then another one is, how do you keep discussion going in something like this? Those are kind of sort of the same answer. So the difference between a asynchronous discussion technology, like we're talking about here, is these technologies are absolutely built to structure what the discussion is with to-dos and reminders and follow